I'd love to read to you by way of introduction a quote from Ellen White. "There is no excuse for anyone taking the position that there is no more truth to be revealed, and that all our expositions of Scripture are without error. The fact that certain doctrines have been held as truth for many years by our people is not proof that our ideas are infallible. Age will not make error into truth, and truth cannot afford to be fair. No doctrine will lose anything by close investigation." Now, we're all here today as comrades in arms, journeying, seekers of truth, meaning, relevance, authenticity, and ultimately Jesus. And all of us personally have a testimony to tell of where that journey has led us, its current condition, and its future directions. One of the most enlightening things I've read in that regard is N. Scott Peck's Stages of Faith, as outlined in The Road Less Travelled. And I'd love you to indulge me while I share with you 4 sentences, because I think the framework of that will give us a paradigm for understanding the intent of the afternoon. His first stage, or faith, is what he calls chaotic or antisocial. That's a person who has no principles, and any social interactions are purely self-serving. The second stage of faith is formal, institutional. Truth is defined by an external body and is given meaning through forms and rituals. His third stage of faith is skeptic, individual. These are people who have often found stage 2 meaningless, quite possibly annoying, and are often found seeking meaning in the green movement or social justice issues. His fourth phase he entitles mystical communal. And in using the term mystical here, he's referring to mystery. This is a stage of faith where people can look at paradoxes and apparent inconsistencies with absolute faith that there is cohesion beneath sometimes an apparent contradictory surface. And in this stage of faith, meaning is found in absolute empathy and practical goodness to others. I know it's possibly tempting to think that we've all arrived and are possibly all at stage 4, but let me remind you that we can all duck back and forth at different times, and really stage 4 is just the beginning. In that context, it's my absolute privilege this afternoon to introduce 2 speakers who are going to challenge and guide us further in our quest for truth and meaning. Now, unlike myself, both Dr. Robin Priestley and Dr. Lyndon Rogers are real doctors. Their CVs are long, glowing, and quite awe-inspiring. But by way of introduction today, I don't want to list their achievements, but I want to speak more as a referee or give a bit of a testimony to the blessing that they have been in my life. Now, when I was at a very black and white stage of my faith, my cronies assured me that this pair were particularly liberal in their interpretations and possibly not even true believers. Yet in my interactions at that stage of my faith with this pair, I could not deny their humility, their warmth, and their genuine practical concern for others, not always apparent in myself or my cronies at that stage of my faith. As my journey and life stage took me to a more cynical phase of my life, I again thought of this pair and others of their ilk. I absolutely respected their wisdom and intellect. I knew them for their genuine Christianity, and I found their loyalty to a flawed institution and their willingness and their capability to be comfortable with the paradoxes of truth something that kept me searching and believing. So thank you very much, Lyndon and Robin. I know your CVs are magnificent, but that's a personal referee's testimony for the help that you've given me in my quest for faith. Now, the way the afternoon is going to run is Lyndon and Robin are merely speakers. Both are going to present a pre-prepared piece that's not written by them and not necessarily their opinion, presenting two different ways of interpreting the sanctuary model. Each presentation will run approximately 45 minutes. And as we're listening today, I'd really love you to think firstly of what Ellen White said about our quest for truth. And secondly, I suppose what M. Scott Peck does for me. And as we journey towards truth, we actually grow to a point where we're actually more comfortable with the paradoxes of life, but ever more comfortable in certainty of the Jesus and the underpinnings of it. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Robin Priestley to read the first section.
Thank you, Danielle. I hope I can see this with my glasses since I didn't write it. I'm going to read this, and just a couple of occasions Arthur is going to add a little bit to it. So I'll start. I'm delivering this paper about the historic Seventh-day Adventist position on the sanctuary and the investigative judgment. Just an introduction. This paper seeks to distill the essential elements of this key doctrine as it has been understood and articulated by the Seventh-day Adventist Church over the last 150 years, together with the biblical arguments commonly used in its support. It also briefly traces the development of these understandings over the last 150 years and the reasons for these changes. The primary focus is on the biblical material from Daniel, Hebrews and Revelation, which along with that from Leviticus, Adventists have always understood to be foundational for sanctuary understanding. Every attempt has been made to nuance each perspective accurately. Some reference is made to supporting documentation, which may be consulted by those of you who are interested. Although the two are closely linked, it's useful to differentiate two principal aspects of the Adventist sanctuary understanding. The first of these concerns the time element, the beginning, duration and end points of the 2,300 days and associated prophecies from Daniel 12. The second focus is on the event or transition thought to have taken place at the end of these periods. So, to look at the historical development of the sanctuary doctrine, first of all, the time frame. It's important to note that the first of the two dimensions noted, namely the time element of the sanctuary doctrine, emerged well prior to the formation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and, in fact, predated the 1844 Great Disappointment. The vibrant expectation of Christ's spectacular return in the early 1840s was based on 15 scriptural timelines developed within the Millerite movement, a number of which were based on the book of Daniel. One of the most specific of these end-time pointers, and certainly the most significant for the Seventh-day Adventist Church that was soon to emerge from Millerism, was based on Daniel 8 and 9. Study of his KJV Bible, with the aid of Cruden's Concordance, had persuaded Miller that the 2,300 days prior to the cleansing of the sanctuary of Daniel 8:14 represented the same number of years. This he established by the use of the day for a year principle implied by such texts as Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6. It's important to note that Miller was one of many Bible students and scholars from the early 1800s from different countries and religious persuasions who used the year-day principle to set the fulfillment of Daniel 8:14 in the 1840s. The problem was that there was no indication in Daniel 8 of when this time period should start, and Arthur has a few comments at this stage.
Robin, all of these historical details take life when you know the people that struggled through these experiences. 7 years ago, Joan and I were caretakers at the William Miller farm, and for the first time I had access to the contents of the barrel that had been put up in the attic, which had lain there undiscovered for many, many decades. And when finally Jim Nix was able to spearhead the purchase of Miller's home, the Adventists opened the barrel. We now understand from the kinds of records I mentioned this morning that we have on microfiche and film that you can read, and a wealth of other things, brings these individuals to vibrant life. They're not just facts on a page.
Thanks, Arthur. However, the prophecy which concludes the following chapter, the chapter after Daniel 8, Daniel 9, 24 to 27, was clearly also important because of its reference to another time period, that of 70 weeks, and also because of its reference to Messiah the Prince. Miller, with others, discovered that in the introductory verse of this passage, the verb kartak, possibly pronounced that way, I've had two versions told me today, rendered determined in the KJV, could also be translated as cut off. It seemed reasonable to these sincere Bible students that the only time period from which the 70 weeks could be cut off was the 2,300 days of the previous chapter. Since the latter prophecy did specify the initiating event, namely the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem, the association of these two prophecies was seen to provide the missing starting date for the 2,300-year prophecy. Enthusiastic research yielded 457 BC as the start date which located the terminus in 1843. The authenticity of the starting date appeared to be further confirmed by its compatibility with the death of Christ, initially thought by the Millerites to have occurred in AD 33, at the end of the 70th week. This date for the crucifixion was confirmed by marginal notes in many KJV Bibles of the time. In the early 1840s, these dates were both corrected and more tightly specified by Samuel S. Snow and George Storrs in what became known as the Seventh Month Movement. They noted that Daniel 9 appeared to specify the crucifixion in the middle of the 70th week, not at its end, as Miller had understood. They also realised that a correction had to be made due to the fact that there was no actual year zero. With due allowance to the placement of the Jewish Day of Atonement, the date for the Second Coming was finally set at October 22nd, 1844. Snow's God was a very exact timekeeper. Characteristically reluctant to tie himself down too tightly, Miller himself could only be brought to endorse the October 22nd date in the last week leading up to it. Now we come to the 1844 event. The discussion from this point concerns the second aspect of the sanctuary understanding, the transition or event itself. For Millerites, the term cleanse in Daniel 8:14 seemed to suggest a link with the ritual cleansing associated with the Levitical Day of Atonement. However, 1844 was clearly well past the destruction of the last literal Jewish temple in 1770 AD, and thus it was thought that the object of this cleansing must be the earthly sanctuary, suggesting the second coming and final consummation. After the day of expectation came and went, leaving the Adventists weeping until the day dawned, Miller and many of his followers admitted that they must have made some mistake and therefore repudiated their early views.
And here is the most important primary source for October 23, 1844, in the handwriting of Hiram Edson. When I stand by his grave, I think that probably he is one of the fathers of the church that I cherish, even though I think he is a marker on a journey, not the ultimate point of arrival.
Some abandoned their Christianity altogether, although others, like Miller himself, retained their faith in God. A small group of these, particularly Hiram Edson, quickly came to focus on the end event rather than the timing, which was not questioned. Picking up on scriptural references to a heavenly pattern after which the earthly sanctuary was fashioned, they formed the view that the sanctuary cleansing The sanctuary cleansing mooted in Daniel 8:14 did not involve the earth, as had earlier been thought, but the sanctuary in heaven, and that it must indicate some significant change in Jesus' heavenly ministry on their behalf. The attention of this group was drawn to the book of Hebrews with its extensive comparison between the Old Covenant involving the earthly sanctuary and the Aaronic priesthood, and the new, superior covenant with its heavenly counterparts, in which Christ himself is our great high priest. The young Ellen Harmond was associated with this group and provided confirmation of this view. 12 years of ardent Bible study on this topic led our pioneers to conclude that on his ascension, Christ commenced an intercessory ministry in the first compartment of the heavenly sanctuary, pleading his blood before the Father on behalf of sinners. On October 22, 1844, Christ moved to the inner apartment, the most holy place, there to commence a similar cleansing work to that accomplished by the ancient high priest on the Levitical Day of Atonement. This was deemed to be a work of investigation and judgment. The first of the three angels of Revelation 14 was seen as announcing this judgment. Thus, the two apartments of the Old Testament sanctuary were perceived as modelling the entire New Testament era. Christ's first apartment ministration commenced after his ascension and lasted until 1844, after which he began his second apartment ministry, which will terminate with the close of probation and the second coming. This view is represented in the figure that's about to emerge, yes? So we need to consider now the theological foundations of this historic doctrine. As noticed in our historical sketch, the Adventist sanctuary doctrine rests principally on the passages from the books of Daniel, Hebrews, and Revelation. We now examine each of those books in turn. I should just add that although it is very important to the Adventist sanctuary understanding, Leviticus is only invoked as it is seen to be connected with these three books, rather than having it treated separately, which facilitates the comparison of different viewpoints on the sanctuary, since there's no significant disagreement about what Leviticus is saying. First of all, Daniel. This book is used to support both aspects of Seventh-day Adventist sanctuary understanding, the two being very interlinked. First, the time frame from Daniel. Daniel 2 speaks of a great composite image, which is generally understood to represent a sequence of earthly kingdoms from Babylon, the incumbent power at the time of Daniel, to the end of this world, at which all these earthly authorities would be swept away by the stone of no human origin, which would grow to fill the whole earth, establishing God's everlasting kingdom. Seventh-day Adventist exegesis sees in the four great beasts of chapter 7 the same period of Earth's history. Out of the fourth beast, Rome, grows a little horn which during the New Testament era oppresses the saints of God to the utmost extent of its very great power. The vision of chapter 8, after another discussion of Medo-Persia and Greece, again talks about a little horn which would do great things against God. It would magnify itself, even to the prince of the hosts, take away the daily and cast down the sanctuary, which would remain desolate for 2,300 days. At the conclusion of this period, the cleansing of the sanctuary would commence. On the basis of these numerical prophecies, the end date of 1844 was chosen, as earlier discussed. Because of its huge significance, Adventists have seen Daniel 8:14 as the prophetic high point of this book. Now, to list the principal exegetical points which Daniel used to support this time frame. First, an understanding of Daniel's visions as applying to a time period which begins with the prophet and explicitly extends to the setting up of God's kingdom at the destructive end of this world, mandating a gap of at least 1800 years between Christ's first and second coming. Secondly, the understanding of the 2,300 days as years, according to the year-day principle, expressed in such verses as Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6. Thirdly, the exegesis of the Hebrew word kartak in Daniel 9:24 to mean cut off, which allows the 70 weeks or 490 years to be cut off from the longer preceding 2,300 days or years. And lastly, the identification of the Ezra 7 decree of Artaxerxes as the start of the 2,300 years and the dating of this decree at 457 BC. Also from Daniel, we now look at the event of 1844. Much later than the times of the four beasts in chapter 7 comes a judgment scene, where thrones are placed, the record books are opened, and judgment was given to the saints, following which the saints receive their inheritance, the recreated world. Judgment is clearly the theme of this chapter. The words "judgment was given to the saints" were taken to imply that God's people were the primary focus of Daniel 7:22, an idea which seemed to gain support from the Day of Atonement ritual of Leviticus 16, where the focus was cleansing the sanctuary from the accumulated sins of Israel. It is certainly true that many Jewish sources identify the Day of Atonement as a day of judgment. Also Ezekiel 9:6, where the destruction of idolatry was to begin at my sanctuary, appeared to lend support to this view. As noted, the Adventist pioneers developed the concept of a pre-Advent investigative judgment of all those having any claim of being God's people, beginning with the dead saints and moving on to the living, after which the Lord would come to claim those whom this process had revealed to be worthy of eternal life. It is this process which Adventists have traditionally identified with the cleansing of the sanctuary and understood to have commenced in 1844. This detailed judgment of the wicked would take place later during the millennium following the second coming. So the principal exegetical points which support the nature of the 1844 event in Daniel are: first, the understanding of both the judgment of Daniel 7 and the sanctuary cleansing of Daniel 8 to apply primarily to the pre-Advent judgment of the saints. Ellen White writes, "The coming of Christ as our new high priest to the most holy place for the cleansing of the sanctuary, brought to view in Daniel 8:14, the coming of the Son of Man as to the Ancient of Days, as presented in Daniel 13, are the same event." The second point, the identification of the sanctuary of Daniel 3:13 and 14 as a tight reference to the heavenly sanctuary specifically, excluding any application to any sanctuary or religious activity on earth. And lastly, the understanding of the Hebrew word sardak, rendered cleansed by the KJV in Daniel 8:14, to apply primarily to the cleansing of the sanctuary from the sins of God's people, thus strongly suggesting a link with the Day of Atonement of Leviticus 16. So now looking at the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews has never been used by Adventists to support the 1844 date, but was extensively used to establish the nature of the event believed to have taken place at that time. This book quickly caught the attention of the disappointed believers in the weeks following October 22nd, 1844. It has much to say about Christ's role as our high priest in the heavenly sanctuary, and it is from this book that Ellen White quotes principally in the first two chapters on the sanctuary in her influential book, The Great Controversy. These two chapters have been very significant in establishing the Adventist understanding of the sanctuary. The principal exegetical points from Hebrews used in the establishment of the historical Adventist position are these: the understanding of the term holy place of Hebrews 9:12 as a reference to the actual holy place, that is, the outer of the two principal temple apartments. And secondly, the understanding of within the veil of Hebrews 6:19 as a reference to the curtain providing access to this outer apartment. In combination, these exegetical interpretations support the view that Christ entered the outer apartment of the heavenly sanctuary upon his ascension, as forcefully urged by Ellen White in the following quote: "After his ascension, our Saviour began his work as our high priest, Says Paul, Christ is not entered into the holy places made by hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. The ministration of the priest through the year in the first department of the sanctuary, within the veil, which formed the door and separated the holy place from the outer court, represents the work of ministration upon which Christ entered at his ascension. Thither the faith of Christ's disciples followed him as he ascended from their sight. Here their hope centred, which hope we have, said Paul, as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which entereth into that within the veil. Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. She concludes, for 18 centuries this work of ministration continued in the first department of the sanctuary. Early Adventists quickly identified their movement with the three angels' messages of Revelation 14. Of particular significance was verse 7, where the first angel announces that the hour of his judgment is come. As we have seen, this judgment was identified as the cleansing of the sanctuary in Daniel 8. Ellen White writes in connection with the investigative judgment, it is this work of judgment immediately preceding the second advent that is announced in the first angel's message in Revelation 14:7. Both the prophecy of Daniel 8:14 and the first angel's message pointed to Christ's ministration in the most holy place, to the investigative judgment. A number of less significant exegetical points from Revelation have been used to buttress the sanctuary and end-time schema. For example, the eating of the little book found in the sixth trumpet in Revelation 10, which was said to be sweet in the mouth but bitter in the belly. This was understood as the eager 1844 expectation of Christ's return and subsequent bitter disappointment. Finally, in this paper, we look at some changes in the sanctuary doctrine. Interestingly, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has seen no reason to re-evaluate the timing aspects of the sanctuary doctrine. However, the last 150 years have seen considerable development in our understanding of the event thought to have taken place in 1844. As we have learned more about biblical apocalyptic and become better able to appreciate its use of symbol and metaphor, there has been less emphasis within the church on the actual architecture of the heavenly sanctuary and a greater focus on the different phases of heavenly ministry represented by the two earthly apartments. The value genesis study of the 1970s and 80s showed quantitatively that Adventists enjoyed lower levels of salvation assurance than many other comparable Christian groups. This had been qualitatively observed by many prior to this study and had been seen by some as at least partially due to our historic emphasis on the saints coming under judgment at some unknown but imminent time, rather than emphasis on Christ's provision for us. This may be one reason why Dr. Richard Davidson of Andrews University Theological Seminary stated at a recent North New South Wales camp meeting that he had removed some of the pictures from some of our earlier books, lest they prove counterproductive to the faith he was attempting to nurture within his family. Over recent decades, the term investigative judgment, although still official, has fallen into relative disuse, and there has developed a much more Christ-centred approach to what is increasingly called the pre-Advent judgment. Although not yet reflected in the fundamentals statement, a number of points agreed in the consensus statement emerging from Glacier View in 1980, such as the identity of the veil in Hebrews, represent changes from the early exegetical platform on which the sanctuary doctrine rests. Perhaps as a result of such concessions, some leading Adventist scholars, such as review editors Francis Nichol and William Johnson, have placed some distance between the Seventh-day Adventist sanctuary understanding and the book of Hebrews, claiming that the latter has its own agenda and does not really speak to these details of the sanctuary doctrine. It is important, however, to note that those quoted above as contributing to what may be seen as a growth in Adventist sanctuary understanding have never questioned the timing of 1844 or the 2,300 days, or the identification of the cleansing of the sanctuary with a pre-Advent judgment. It is probably fair to observe that contemporary defenders of the historic sanctuary doctrine fall into two main categories: those who accept Ellen White's scriptural development of the doctrine, including her understanding of Hebrews, and those who still affirm the general schema but do not attempt to buttress it from the book of Hebrews. And we come to a sudden end at that stage.
Dr. Rogers is running two hats here. You all saw evidence of his computer expertise, and he's now going to come and read the second response. Thank you.
To follow, but certainly drafts as they are corrected will be available most certainly on the net somewhere. If you keep in contact with Forum or with Arthur Patrick, you can find out where. In an attempt to think laterally outside the usual square, we always face a challenge. Obelix, one of my favourite characters, had been down on the seashore with his bosom friend Obelix, Asterix, and had eaten rather more than his fair share of oysters. He was having trouble running. So Asterix said to him, "Obelix, I've told you before, oysters are like nuts. You only eat the inside." To which Obelix replies, "Well, personally, I eat nuts, shell and all, the same way I eat oysters." So your starting point can give you a very, very different perspective. We're asking you this afternoon to put your thinking caps on and do your best to bend your minds around an alternative position, having heard the historic Adventist one. This sanctuary model builds on the same biblical material as used previously, but concludes somewhat differently. As we've seen, the traditional model sees two Old Testament sanctuary apartments and their services as pointing forward to two post-cross phases of ministry, separated by the year 1844, that is, ministry for Christ. The alternative model is somewhat different. It interprets the ministries of the Old Testament sanctuary not so much as representing two phases of Christ's ministry, but as symbolic of two eras of interaction between humanity and God. These eras, rather than covering just the New Testament, include the whole of human history, and the cross itself separates the two. Let's look at the theological foundations of this alternative position. Clearly, it's not possible to use the schema of time frame and 1844 event used in the earlier paper, since no particular prophetic significance attaches to 1844. Let's examine the primary biblical material in the same sequence as we earlier used, and on the way pick up the different principles of interpretation used. Firstly, the book of Daniel. It should be noted that the traditional Adventist model and the alternative position have a great deal in common. Both viewpoints affirm that Daniel's vision extends to the end of earthly history. Both emphasise the significance of Daniel 8:13 and 14. Both see the symbolism of sanctuary desecration and restoration as the central theme of Daniel and having cosmic dimensions. After all, this book begins with a desecrated sanctuary, the Jerusalem temple in ruins. The primary difference between the two sanctuary models has to do with understanding the passage of time in Daniel's apocalyptic passages. This divergence is illustrated in Daniel's very first vision in chapter 2, and I'm hoping that you have, as well as a rustling piece of paper, a very clear mental image of the way that chapter unfolds. Both viewpoints understand this prophetic picture to extend to the time of the end. However, while historic Adventism understands this period to be the immediate lead-up to the end of time, Those espousing the alternative position note that the Old Testament presents a very different view of the time of the end. This comes about because the Old Testament does not differentiate clearly, if at all, between Christ's first and second comings. This is very easy for us to miss, because we have a very linear view of time, and we can read of 20 centuries of Earth's history between those events, at least that period of time. Most scholars, though, have argued that the coming of the kingdom of God, first introduced in chapter 2 and further developed in later chapters, coalesces both the first and the second comings of Jesus, much in between, and even some things after, such as the final destruction of evil. As far back as 1876, Bishop Wordsworth wrote in his commentary on Isaiah, Isaiah sees nothing between the gospel of Christ and the day of judgment. To him, the days of the Christian dispensation are the last days. This is sometimes compared to a photograph, and I took one not so long ago, not realising that this film had already been through the camera. A double exposure, two images superimposed. This may partially explain why the Jews of Jesus' day didn't in fact recognise him. On the basis of many of the messianic prophecies, they did have some reason to expect Christ to come with rulership. Only with the New Testament insights given to us by Christ do we have a clear picture of a second coming with its attendant kingdom of glory. The alternative view argues that all of the great climaxes in Daniel, and there are a number of them, incorporate elements of both messianic appearances. As the New Testament makes clear, Christ's death inaugurated, as it's said, the kingdom of God on earth just as tangibly as his second coming and subsequent recreation of earth will consummate it. These terms are commonly used by scholars. In this sense, Daniel's expression, time of the end, is more accurately understood as referring not just to the end of the Christian era, but to all of it. Another obvious reason suggested by those who adhere to this alternative position why a simple time sequence may be difficult to apply is that, as later chapters reveal, the sequence of desecrating attacks against the saints and the sanctuary, God's subsequent deliverances, and his punishment of their oppressors actually keeps reoccurring right until the end. There is such a similar pattern to these assaults that they seem to run together. The language of Daniel would appear to revolve more around the recognition of this pattern and a promise of a termination to it than around any particular act in the sequence. The alternative position views the 5 prophetic sequences within the book of Daniel as running parallel, all covering essentially the same subject, in this respect not differing too much from the historic Adventist perspective, together building a composite picture of God's spectacular 11th hour rescue of his people and his comprehensive final solution to the sin problem. In chapter 2, as we've noted, we have the ushering in of God's kingdom, and that occurs with the arrival of a stone of supernatural origin, and this begins a series of 8 or 9 points that arise from the book of Daniel, which should be understood in the general context of the double exposure concept already elaborated. This stone strikes the composite image on the feet and grows to fill the entire earth. It should be noted that in Hebrew, the sun stone, Eben Ben, wordplay was a very, very common double entendre. Almost inevitably, early readers would have understood this stone as referring to the sun. Certainly, Christ applied Daniel's expression to himself. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be broken to pieces. In commenting on the parallel passage in Matthew, the Seventh-day Adventist commentary confirms the similarity of language in these two passages. It's also interesting to note the next development. Nebuchadnezzar goes on to build a golden image, signifying his intention that it will be struck by no stones. But some have pointed out that the stone arrives uninvited in the form of one whom even the king acknowledges as a son of the gods. This view of Daniel's prophecies gives far greater prominence to the first coming of Christ, at which a deadly blow was dealt to evil, than does our historic Adventist scenario, which recognises Christ's earthly sojourn only briefly in chapter 9. Such a comprehensive prophetic vision, it is suggested, of world's history would surely include the event which divided that history, namely the Christ event. Those favouring the alternative viewpoint claim that such an interpretation is in much greater resonance with the stated aim of Scripture, namely to declare Christ. The next section, who is being judged, which arises from considerations in Daniel chapter 7, I'm going to gloss over because this point has been very largely conceded by church scholars of most persuasions. Even the consensus document gives this point a very fair hearing, and I don't propose to spend further time on it. Just to note the concluding paragraph, the alternate view would urge that although Daniel does begin with the destruction of Jerusalem because of Israel's sins, and although chapter 9 articulates these sins quite clearly, the focus of this book, and certainly this chapter 7, is not on Israel's sins, but rather the sins of the evil powers that oppress God's people. There is no contextual focus on the sins of the saints in this passage, hence no basis for the idea of the investigative judgment as we have historically conceived it. The next point concerns the 2300 evening and mornings of chapter 8. And one of the principal issues that arises from this reference concerns the use of the day for a year principle, very, very importantly used in establishing the Seventh-day Adventist viewpoint. It is certainly true that most well-known 17th, 18th and 19th century exegetes employed it in connection with Daniel, and that is an important point to make, as well, of course, as with other Old Testament passages as well. But it's also important to note that it has not enjoyed very much continuing support. This has been checked out fairly recently in the preparation of this paper, and a very large number of authoritative commentaries on Daniel do not even reference the year-day principle today. It's also important to note that in Daniel 8:14, the Hebrew term for day is not actually used. It is evenings, mornings, which in the context of the abolition of the daily sacrifice, the Tamid of verses 11, 12 and 13, would appear contextually to refer to the evening and morning sacrifices. Those who hold this view would invite you to take your Bibles at some stage and check this out for yourselves. And of course there were 2 of these each day, which gives rise to the prevailing opinion among most modern scholars that this period refers to 2300 evenings and mornings, that is 1150 days, rather than the 2300 days of evening and morning. You should note a fairly extended footnote there. There are a number of points that are raised in connection with sustaining this point, which do not seem to have been considered at the time Miller and others were examining this topic. If you look at the end of Daniel 8, you will find that, I think it's in verse 24, it repeats the reference to the evenings and mornings. It gives the definite article between each, the evenings and the mornings, indicating to a number of scholars that this suggests that it's talking about 2 separate entities and counting them separately. It's also interesting to point out, and the adherents of the alternative position certainly do this, that if you look at many of the Old Testament references to the ecclesiastical events associated with the religious observance of the Jews, the Sabbath, many of the events within their annual religious calendar, they start with the evening and go to the morning. And the same language is used in the Old Testament to describe the tamid, the sacrifices of the evening and the morning. Despite this consensus, though, about 1150 days, certainly most would admit that some uncertainty must remain over this point. In any case, the application of the day for a year principle in this instance is definitely somewhat strained, it's suggested, because no word day is actually there, even if it were accepted as a guiding principle. It's also noted that over in Daniel chapter 12, if you turn to it, there are a number of other time periods given, 2 of them, and in that instance, in chapter 12, the word day is definitely there. So if, in fact, day had been intended in chapter 8, as in fact it appears in chapter 12, there is no reason why Daniel couldn't have made that more explicit by using exactly the same word that he used in the last chapter. Let's look at the power profaning the sanctuary. Most contemporary Jewish and Christian expositors see in Daniel 8 a reference to the career of Antiochus Epiphanes, a Seleucid king. This was a common opinion right back in the 19th century, although of course early Adventists repudiated it. Whether it does indeed refer to the ravages of Antiochus, or whether it looks further for its initial fulfilment to the much more powerful Roman Empire, may ultimately remain unresolved. What is unambiguous is that this period represents tough times for God's people. It's certainly true that Antiochus Epiphanes was the first human ruler to persecute the Jews on solely religious grounds. It's also true that his desecration of the temple and the literal setting up of abominations there, such as the sacrifice of swine, lasted approximately 1100 days. 3 years and 8 days, according to some of the scholarly sources referenced, until the restoration by Judas Maccabeus. This is reasonably close, it's suggested by those that take the alternative view, to the 1150 days of the prophecy, given the approximate nature of scriptural usage of number. It's also interesting to note that John 10:22 mentions Christ's participation in the annual Jewish festival commemorating that event. And of course there's no doubt that it has ongoing significance for Jews even to our day. But it is also true that Antiochus was a rather squalid little monarch, for whom some of the powerful descriptors used here in connection with the desecrator do seem totally inappropriate. Those espousing the alternative position note the repetitious strain of those prophecies, and most take the view that Antiochus, while perhaps not matching every detail, is an intended type of those greater powers which would later do exactly the same thing, for exactly the same reasons, but on a much greater scale. The next question concerns verse 14, cleansed or vindicated. And again, this one has been conceded a little more readily in recent years. The Hebrew word that our pioneers translated cleansed, indeed it's reflected that way in the King James Version, and later on I will be using the King James Version a little more explicitly. It's the one I brought with me. If it was good enough for the Apostle Paul, Danielle, it must surely be good enough for me. Although this is rendered cleansed in the King James, most scholars today, and for a considerable period, have recognised that justified, set right, restored to its final state, or vindicated are much more likely translations. This also provides a much more authentic and obvious match with the theme of the preceding chapter, where you'll remember that the people of God have come under pressure by a persecuting, desecrating power. And in this chapter, chapter 8, as in chapter 7, God is seen to be vindicating his people. Daniel 8:14's vindication of the sanctuary would seem a parallel image to Daniel 7, which is of course a point, as we've seen already, that Sister White recognised. The question, how long, in verse 13 is perhaps the central cry of pain for this entire book, and indeed for human experience, and none would disagree with that. The decisive answer given may be primarily intended to reveal the limited duration of this apparent triumph of evil, rather than to specify exact timelines. Which brings us to chapter 9, where the main difference revolves around the interpretation of a key verse in 24. And I think you know what I'm talking about. The word translated determined in the King James. The aged prophet has been lamenting and confessing the sins of Judah and worrying about the previous vision, many features of which he found impenetrable, even after the angel had explained the details to him. And I don't know about you, but I find that rather a comfort. It's interesting that on at least that occasion, and I think another, Daniel doesn't understand. He knew that the 70 years of Babylonian captivity were almost over, and he must have been eagerly anticipating the restoration and the vindication of Jerusalem after all those years. And as one who remembered it in its former glory, it must have been 70 years of pain. That pain is exacerbated as he's given a message about an even longer period, literally 77s, at the end of which the most holy will be anointed. As we've seen, our pioneers in search of a starting date for the 2300 days noted that this verb could be rendered as cut off. The adoption of this reading and the assumption that 77s were cut from the previous 2300 days enabled the establishment of a starting date for the 2300 days. However, scholars are generally agreed that while this word does have a root meaning of to cut, it is more accurately translated as decreed, determined, or allotted. Although it has the root meaning to cut, it's much more of an extension to take that to cut off. And usage suggests decreed, determined, or allotted as being a much more appropriate translation. Besides, and this is a most important point to note, and this is conceded also by the new edition of the Seventh Adventist Bible Commentary, the year for a day principle is not so readily applicable here because once again, the word day is not actually there. No specific time period is mentioned at all, is a point made repeatedly by people who affirm the alternative viewpoint. What about the starting date? Despite 150 years of biblical scholarship and archaeological studies since the time of Miller, scholars remain in some agreement over which of the three major decrees, and they are in Ezra and Nehemiah, should be understood as the starting point for the 77s. None of these decrees appear to fit the specifications of the prophecy exactly, and you would be invited to check that out for yourself. Considerable uncertainty also remains over the exact dates. A check of scholarly views on this date indicated a period over a number of decades that seemed to be reasonably possible, or at least seemed to be possible to these scholars. Even working backwards is difficult because there is still some uncertainty over the date of the crucifixion. Whilst it is generally dated by scholars to be AD 30, there is a small group who prefer AD 32. Interestingly, AD 31 doesn't appear to be a very viable option. Everyone agrees, though, that Daniel 9, 24 to 27 is one of the most magnificent passages of Scripture and is perhaps the focal point of this book. Within its broad scope, transgression is finished, atonement for sin is made, everlasting righteousness arrives, vision and prophecy are concluded, and the most holy place is anointed. Clearly, God's kingdom is established, with the sanctuary specifically in focus. However, those holding the alternative viewpoint would note that, as with earlier Daniel passages, the elements of this grand resolution are not tightly time-sequenced, and some are a little bit difficult to place, some of the details. So let's try and summarise Daniel. It should be pointed out that in recent years there have been some concessions, and I have mentioned this. The Glacier View consensus statement on the sanctuary accepts the focus of Daniel 7 is on the sins of the desecrator rather than the saints. Those who support the alternative view identified two significant problems with the historic Adventist understanding. The first concerns its failure to appreciate the doubly exposed prophetic picture of the end time, to recognise that the time of the end is the New Testament era. In this sense, it does not sufficiently emphasise the gospel it has suggested, and though from omission rather than commission, could be said to risk coming under the very judgment of which Daniel warns. The second concerns its reliance on a number of questionable historical markers, translations and connections, all of which have to be true. These include the 457 BC date for the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, establishing that the 2300 evening mornings does mean 2300 days, demonstrating the validity of the year for a day principle as applied to these two prophecies, neither of which use the term day, establishing the 490-year period is cut off from the 2300 days, and establishing that cleanse is the intended translation in Daniel 8:14. This can be compared to a chain consisting of a number of links. And it's been the sad experience of some of us that you only have to lose one link in a chain and everything comes unstuck. And that's a most important point which is urged by those who would support the alternative viewpoint. While most supporters of the alternative view would concede that the assumptions elaborated above are possible, they would point out that they do not represent the preferred scholarly opinion, and some are most unlikely indeed. Only one of these exegetical links has to fail, and the desolation of the doctrine follows. This places the whole idea at risk, according to the criteria for evaluating options that people use today. Which of the two options you are considering have the most obvious cohesion, consistency, coherence, and which involves the least ad hoc special pleading, sometimes referred to as the principle of inference to the best explanation, if you read Alistair McGrath, sometimes also known as the hypothetico-deductive method. Those who support the alternative view stress the coherence of their position and also the way that it avoids the risks that we've discussed. But they would admit that the complexity of Daniel's symbolism and its internal tensions leaves a number of issues tantalizingly unresolved. Now let's turn our attention to the book of Hebrews, where the people who take this alternative viewpoint would speak much more definitely. While some who hold the alternative viewpoint might concede that Daniel has some obscure points, they would urge that the New Testament book of Hebrews is much clearer and fits only one model, theirs. They suggest that this book can only be tenuously construed to fit the traditional model. Hebrews begins by contrasting the old ways in which God spoke to us with a new mode of communication through his Son. As the chapters develop, this comparison and contrast continues. We are warned that just as the Jews of old could not ignore Moses and the prophets without peril, so if we neglect the great salvation, the provision which has been made for us, we will be in even more dire straits. The following chapters establish the superiority of Christ's new priesthood over the Aaronic priesthood in so many different ways. But it is, of course, in chapter 9 that this discussion is substantially developed. This chapter reminds its readers of the sanctuary associated with the Old Covenant, its fitments, its services, its apartments. Then, in complete character with the early part of the book, verse 11 speaks of the greater and more perfect tabernacle not made with hands, which Christ enters as our high priest, not with the blood of animals, but by his own blood. Not in earthly places made by humans, but into heaven itself. Not repeatedly, as in the old order, but only once. Those who support the alternative sanctuary position point out that the whole book, but particularly this chapter, has been setting up Christ as the high priest, and they would urge that the very clear context is the Day of Atonement. High priest, once a year, not without blood. You find that formula in a number of places. And the clear summary message is that Christ put away sin by his own sacrifice. In other words, the Old Testament Day of Atonement was a symbol of the New Testament times. The Old Testament Day of Atonement was a symbol in Old Testament times for what Christ would later accomplish. This is explicitly referenced there in verse 9. Perhaps you would like to turn to it and read it. This was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect as pertaining to the conscience, and so it goes on. And that is the reason why the alternative model sees the Old Testament era, or the first apartment of the sanctuary in the Old Testament, as representing the earth history up until the time of the cross. The only ambiguity seems to be in the temple apartment terminology employed in this chapter. As we've seen, our pioneers, including Ellen White, understood the holy place as rendered in the King James verse in chapter 12, and we'll come to it in just a minute, and verse 24, to literally mean the holy place, as in the technically outer of the two temple apartments. Let's look at some quotations there. We've already seen some of these quotations, but I want us to notice them again. They are very significant. After his ascension, our Saviour began his work as our high priest. Paul said, Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear for us. The ministration of the priest throughout the year represented the work of ministration upon which Christ entered at his ascension. Thither the faith of Christ's disciples followed him as he ascended from their sight. Here their hope centred, which hope we have, said Paul, as an anchor of the soul, steadfast and sure, and which entereth into that within the vial. Neither by the blood of goats and calves he entered in once into the holy place, with his own blood having obtained eternal redemption for us. And then she makes a very significant statement. For 18 centuries this work of ministration continued in the first apartment. Clearly, she is applying the ministry of Christ here in verse 12 of chapter 9 to Christ's pre-1844, in other words, if you like, high priestly ministry, to the ministry associated with the first apartment of the temple. However, those holding the alternative view would urge that the context clearly negates this reading of Hebrews 9, using the very basic of exegetical principles, lexically, syntactically, historically, contextually, and according to the broad analogy of Scripture. There you are, Arthur. I did remember it. Many people object to the use of modern translations like the NIV, but those who support the alternative position would point out that you can quite comfortably use the King James. You just need to look at the context. And even more specifically than the context is verse 24 of chapter 9. You might like to look at it. For Christ is not entered into the holy places. The term is exactly the same. It's holy places. It's not most holy, it's holy places. That's what is said. Made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor yet that he should offer himself often, as the high priest enters into the holy place every year. Verse 25, the holy place is entered every year. Clearly, it's the most holy place which is entered every year. So the placement of verses 24 and 25 against verse 12 would urge those who support the alternative position make it fairly clear what is intended. And they would also point out that many, if not most, modern translations support this viewpoint. Those supporting the alternative view would respectfully conclude that Sister White misunderstood this passage. She applies unambiguous Day of Atonement symbolism to a daily priestly ministry in the outer apartment. In fact, Ellen White quotes from Hebrews only in the Great Controversy chapter discussing the outer apartment ministry of Christ. There are 2 Great Controversy chapters on the sanctuary. All of the references to Hebrews occur in the first of them, where she is addressing the first apartment ministry. Fascinatingly, as pointed out by those who espouse the alternative model, in the second of the 2 chapters, the holiest of all, where the focus is principally on a high priestly ministry, Ellen White does not reference the book of Hebrews at all. Supporters of the alternative position point out a related irony. The historic Adventist sanctuary doctrine sees a clear link between Daniel 8:14 and the Leviticus 16 Day of Atonement, and sees this on the basis of a tenuous reading of a single verb, yet misses the Day of Atonement application in Hebrews 9, which seems to systematically invoke it in such unmistakable terms. Such exegetes also find it strange that the significance of the Jewish Day of Atonement to Christ's work on our behalf is clearly recognised by the historic Adventist position, and yet its major emphasis is so badly misplaced. That is, this annual ritual is linked to judgment rather than to Calvary. In the face of this evidence, some adherents of the historic Adventist position have taken the view that Hebrews is just not addressing eschatological issues. But this is a very insecure position, in that these same individuals also claim to be in harmony with Ellen White, who, as we've seen, substantially builds her sanctuary understanding on Hebrews. It's also significant that most of the historical objections to the Adventist sanctuary doctrine have come from the book of Hebrews. There is one particularly interesting quote from F.D. Nicol, one-time editor of the Review and the editor, of course, of our commentary series, in replying to a letter from Pastor Clifford, then the president of our division. He says, "As a result of our meeting with Fletcher, I drew certain conclusions regarding the book of Hebrews." And the first one, which I didn't mention but is so good, I ought to say it, is that he says, "I'm quite sure that some of the things which, according to Peter, the Apostle Paul wrote which are hard to understand are in Hebrews." Then he says, "We ought never to allow our opponents to manoeuvre us into fighting the decisive battle on the sanctuary doctrine on the battlefield of Hebrews. We may willingly grant that it cannot be established with certainty as to what Paul may mean, but we can affirm with certainty that it does not mean what our opponents allege he means. We thus prevent them from bringing us into confusion on the field of Hebrews." And that was written many, many years ago. Adherents to the alternative position point out that if the eschatological dimension of Hebrews is thus discounted, the pivotal doctrine of the sanctuary and investigative judgment is left to rest heavily on 2 or 3 passages, contested ones as we've seen, from a single Old Testament book, Daniel. And this is very much contrary to the practice which we have many times stated of needing to build important doctrines on a broad and rich foundation. They also point out that it seems unusual if the only New Testament book which elaborates on the significance of the Old Testament sanctuary doesn't develop or even mention a key doctrinal position claimed to be based on that sanctuary. After all, most other Old Testament apocalyptic themes are taken up in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospels and Revelation, and such expositors would also agree that although this is perhaps an argument from silence, it is a fairly significant argument from silence. We've already referenced today the statement that Sister White made in Desire of Ages, which indicates her growing in her understanding of some of these applications, but I've got it on the board so that you can actually see it. "The way into the holiest is laid open. A new and living way is prepared for all. But there is now an end for all sacrifices and offerings for sin. By his own blood he entereth in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us." That is a very, very different exegetical usage of Hebrews 9 than we find in the Great Controversy. Before we leave the book of Hebrews, I would like to invite you also to turn to verse 23. Des made a mention of it this morning. It is, I think, a particularly significant point. It is the place in chapter 9 where it actually talks about Daniel's theme of cleansing. It was therefore necessary that the pattern of things in the heavens be purified or cleansed with these, but the heavenly things with much better sacrifices than these. And then it goes on to talk about Christ once sacrificing his own blood, as we've already seen. So those who subscribe to the alternative position would tender that Hebrews is not difficult to understand. Let's turn now quickly to the book of Revelation. Those holding the alternative position agree that there is a strong link between Daniel 7 and Revelation 14. But in contrast to the historic Adventist viewpoint, which understands the first angel's message in Revelation 14:7 as a reference to an investigative judgment beginning with the saints, they see this message as an announcement that God has declared the judgment in favour of God's people and against Babylon. They would point out that the preceding verse introduces this message as the gospel or the good news. And it sounds like much better news if you say it their way, they would say. Also significant is Revelation 18:10, and you might want to turn to it just to check it out, where the same word for judgment is used, but this time it clearly relates to a verdict on Babylon. It's not difficult to understand. Supporters of the alternative position would urge that their view sounds like much better news than does the traditional perspective. There is another point from the gospel which is sometimes raised. It concerns an interesting incident related by all three synoptic gospel writers: the tearing of the inner veil from top to bottom at the time of Christ's death. It's interesting to note that Sister White references this event a number of times, 4 times in The Desire of Ages. But she doesn't reference this event once in her discussion of the sanctuary doctrine in Great Controversy. Furthermore, this incident doesn't feature significantly in many books, articulating the traditional historic Adventist position. And this is understandable, since those holding the latter view usually regard this incident simply as an indication that God had rejected the old Jewish temple and its services. This is an interesting concept, it's been suggested, given the parallel understanding that this actually took place at the stoning of Stephen some little while later. Supporters of the alternative view would urge that this incident, occurring as it did at the moment of Christ's death, highlights the vastly increased access to God brought about by Christ's death, mentioned in Hebrews, whereby we might enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus and draw near in full assurance of faith. The message of Hebrews, particularly in chapter 10, would seem to pick up on this point and would seem to say that the most holy place has now, in a sense, expanded to include the whole world, and we are all in it. And the tearing of the separating veil can then be understood as a powerful symbol for the introduction of this new era of human access to God. How then might we conclude? Another circumstance urged against the historic viewpoint is the lengthening time between 1844 and the present. It's certainly true that our pioneers thought of the investigative judgment in terms of a very short time period indeed. If you look at the literature, you will find, for example, severe castigation of a couple who posted themselves for marriage just a little while after 1844. It was deemed an entirely inappropriate thing to do. Time was not going to last long enough for you two to get married. Even when James White and Ellen Harmon did the same a couple of years later, in 1846, they had to face their storm of criticism. Time wasn't going to last. Our pioneers understood that the judgment began in 1844 and would be brief. Supporters of the alternative position would urge that you can hold one but not both today. What would be our pioneers' reaction if they could be here today? Would they consider 160 years a brief period, or would they perhaps have long since re-examined their prophetic interpretation? One interesting consequence of the alternate position is that the Seventh Adventist Church is not, according to this viewpoint, as clearly identified in prophecy as it is according to the traditional scenario. And this is a problem for many people. Supporters of this alternative position, though, would urge that this in no way invalidates the Adventist Church. After all, according to traditional prophetic interpretation, Luther's Reformation has absolutely no prophetic tags attached at all. It doesn't. Despite this, we've never denied the validity of this important sea change within Christianity. And even more interesting is Sister White's placement of those who carry the end-time message in the direct tradition of the Reformation. It should be noted in conclusion, actually on this point too, there is a statement from Froome that I would like us to consider, and it was alluded to by Des this morning. Too many times we've sought to understand and interpret the heavenly antitype in the light of its earthly types, but that is a fallacious procedure which leads to faulty and inadequate conclusions. We should instead seek to understand the earthly accommodated semblances in the light of the heavenly realities. Leroy Edwin Froome. Once again, this is not a new statement. It should also be noted in conclusion that those who affirm the alternative sanctuary view do not doubt a pre-Advent judgment. All affirm that Christ brings his reward with him and that prior to the second coming, all cases will be decided. Surely for an infinite God, however, this could be a very quick job indeed, rather than a lengthy investigative judgment in which one's name could come up at any time. Supporters of the alternative position would urge that making such an emphasis a primary focus of prophetic interpretation diminishes the weightiest of all prophetic themes, namely that gospel which, and I quote someone that we listened to this morning, makes the heart to sing and the feet to dance.
Thank you very much, Lyndon and Robin. There'll be a short break for 15 minutes for afternoon tea, and then a return to which there'll be a question session with some panellists. Thank you.